All right, we'll move on. Okay. The big contribution of the Jews to humanity appears to have been their religion, the belief of monotheism. And again, I'd emphasized last time how that polytheistic people tend to remain primitive in their scientific achievements, owing to the fact they believe that nature is God. That is, polytheistic people believe nature is God. That the sun is God, the river is God, the wind is God, the storm is God, lightning is God. All phenomena of nature is God. The earth beneath our feet is God. Everything around us is God. Therefore, it all has a mind of its own. The Jews said, no, nature is not God. They were emphatic about it, that God had created nature, but that nature was not God. Therefore, nature had to obey God's laws. And with seemingly, to me anyway, without monotheism, you cannot have the technology, the scientific advancements that we have, because there is a regularity and an order in the universe that the ancient people seem to have not been able to imagine. To where we can make every cake that comes out of the oven taste alike. We can put together two cell phones that are alike and they'll work the same way. Maybe have a different number, but otherwise work the same way. We can put together two automobiles and they'll work alike if we put them together alike. Again, our whole manufacturing technology, we may not realize, but it's based on the Jewish monotheistic belief. Then monotheism was incorporated into Christianity and into Islam, and eventually largely displaced polytheism, at least in the Western world. Again, the Israelis believed that their God was exclusive, that he was the only one and not other. And of course, they believed that they were his chosen people. And some people will say that this is why a lot of the rest of the world hates them. I mean, I've even read this in Jewish literature that they'll say that the claim that they made back then, back yonder, that they were special, that they were God's chosen, has led to their people hating them from that time forward. Again, you can make up your mind for yourself as to why. All right, anybody have any further questions, comments? Yes?
What did you say about Cyrus?
About who?
Cyrus.
Okay, I'm about to get to him. He's the one who allowed the Jews to return to their homeland. Yeah, I'm about to get to him in just a few minutes. Before I do, though, I want to talk about a group of people called the Assyrians. I have mentioned them. Now, what I have already mentioned about it was they conquered and deported Israel. When I say deported, let me explain. The Assyrians, along with other ancient peoples, had the habit of, when they conquered a people, they would deport their upper classes, with the logic being that if they could deport their upper class, people who were left behind would never be able to organize themselves enough to revolt. And again, I couldn't agree with them less. But I mean, hey, after all, the United States is made up of Europe's and Africa's and Asia's outcasts. Nevertheless, they would leave behind the poorer people of the land and carry off the educated, the skilled people, the nobility, and the rich. And then they would scatter these people abroad. In other words, they'd say to you, you move 500 miles away, you move 200 miles in that direction, and you go in the other direction. So they'd scatter these people abroad in hopes that they would forget their identity and never become organized enough to make trouble. And they didn't want to kill them all, because after all, they needed people around to collect revenue from, to collect taxes to enrich themselves. And also, if they killed them all, the wild beasts would multiply against them. So they would deport the upper crust of the population. Anyway, Assyria deported Israel. Now, a couple of things I want to remember about Assyria. I have taken a personal interest in Assyrians, and I've learned that 10 million of them still exist. You don't hear much about them in the news. Half of the ones who are around live in Iraq, but they're not the Kurds. They're a special group of people called the Assyrians. So the other half are scattered all over the globe. They were known for their cruelty. They also were known for their use of iron. Now the Hittites are the first users of iron, but the Assyrians took it up 500 years later. Well, after the Hittite Empire fell, for 500 years there was no big empire. Then the prophets of Judah and Israel would warn them, hey, these nations that are lying dormant, they're going to make a comeback. They're going to come back and they're going to overtake you if you don't forsake your sins. The first of the nations was the Assyrians. Now, we're only going to spend about a minute or two more on the Assyrians, but I want to state there are persons who have devoted their entire lives, their entire careers to studying Assyria. If we had started a week ago with a course on Assyria, I could easily spend a whole semester talking about what we know about them. I mean, they're kings, Shamshi-Adad, Ishbi, Dagon, Ashurbanipal, Sargon, Sennacherib, Esarhaddon. I mean, even when I could go into detail what each of these kings did. In effect, in the spring, they'd get together their armies, and instead of going out and playing baseball, they'd go out and fight somebody. In the fall, they return, rest for the season, then go out in the spring and fight again. This is what it took for them to maintain their empire. And mostly they were fighting barbaric people called the Scythians, but they were also putting down rebellions. In the year 722, they fought Israel and overcame Israel. They fought Egypt once, and they fought a war against the Nubians, whom we talked about last time. They fought against Nubia and won. In fact, all told, the Assyrian Empire lasted 1,000 years. But the last part of the Assyrian Empire only lasted a few generations. But at the beginning of their history, they were strong for about 1,000 years. They claimed to be descended from Ashur, and yes, they worshipped Ashur, their ancestor, as their god, whom they claimed created heaven and earth. All right, I have to move on. So much for the Assyrians. Persia. Well, actually, before I leave the Assyrians, there is another empire that came right after the Babylonian Empire. This was the empire that took Judah captive. Its most famous ruler was Nebuchadnezzar. Now, any of you who've attended Sunday school might have heard of Nebuchadnezzar, one of the more famous kings in the Bible. He is remembered now. Nebuchadnezzar made news in modern times. The year was 1990, and Saddam Hussein was trying to build an empire, and he claimed that he was descended from Nebuchadnezzar. He was going to copy Nebuchadnezzar. And he wanted to rebuild the city of Babylon, and he actually started rebuilding the ancient city of Babylon. He didn't get far, though. The whole world came down on him. But anyway, he claimed that he looked like Nebuchadnezzar. Personally, we don't know what Nebuchadnezzar looked like, and I did not see the resemblance. But he liked two people from the time period we're studying, Nebuchadnezzar and Saladin. And both of those people, well, Nebuchadnezzar was famous for defeating the Jews, and Saladin was famous for defeating the Crusaders. And needless to say, Saddam Hussein liked both of them, but Saddam Hussein wound up being defeated by the United States. Anyway, after that Babylon, and folk, again, I could spend the entire semester talking the Babylonian Empire. I started to write my master's thesis on the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And I could spend, but your book barely mentions it, so we'll move on. Persia. Now, again, there was a man who wrote a book about the Persian Empire that covered 400 pages, and I read it. It was part of my preparation for a master's program, my master's final. But what I wanted to talk about Persia, though, is it's one big famous ruler, Cyrus the Great. Now, I've already mentioned Cyrus a few times. Cyrus's grandfather was a Mede. And the Medes and Persians were rivals. And someone told a vision, said the Persians are going to wind up overtaking the Medes. Well, Cyrus' grandfather, he had no sons, he only had a daughter. And this daughter married a Persian man, which meant that a Persian was lined for the throne. Well, when the Persian king's daughter had a son who obviously was Persian because you became what your father was, the king had Cyrus put in a basket and floated down the river. Some shepherds found him. The shepherds eventually realized that he was the rightful heir to the Persian throne, so they helped to elevate him. Cyrus went back to the palace of his grandfather, who was still alive. You might think that he had a coup in which he killed his grandfather. Not so. He told his grandfather, you must step from your throne. You're not king, but you have free run of the palace. You can move about freely. I know nobody's going to follow you. People are now following me. You've become a little bit too old for your usefulness. And Cyrus simply quietly took over and displaced his grandfather. And the empire was forever after that known as the Persian Empire. Before that it was known as the Medo-Persian Empire. It became Persia. Cyrus had a problem that a lot of men have, even emperors. Cyrus was henpicked by his wife. His wife kept after him, you must conquer. That's what kings are supposed to do, you must conquer. So with that, Cyrus went around conquering, but he was very lenient toward it, unlike the Assyrians, who were known for exceptional cruelty. I don't even want to describe here. In the case of Cyrus, he was lenient. The people who had been conquered by the Babylonians before him, he allowed to go home, including the Jews. Now he was so, unlike a lot of those rulers who were so insecure, they said, no, we're going to destroy your temples, we're going to destroy your religion, we hope you forget your identity. Cyrus allowed the Jews to return home, to rebuild their temple, and even rebuild their walls. And the Jews really looked on him as being very, well, they looked on him highly. In fact, your book has a quote where that today, from the prophet Isaiah, where that he looked on Cyrus as being God's anointed, God's special one. When Cyrus died, his successors built an even bigger empire. They conquered Egypt, they conquered Canaan, they conquered Phoenicia, and they expanded all the way to the borders of India. And they started to conquer Greece, or tried to, but that's a subject for a later chapter. The Persian kings who tried to conquer Greece were defeated. They got Turkey, what's today Turkey, Asia Minor, but when they tried to cross over to Greece, the Greeks had better weaponry and better discipline, and they defeated the Persian armies. Again, when it comes to Greek history, we're talking how the King Xerxes, well, King Darius sent an army and he lost. His son Xerxes sent another army and he lost. And eventually, the Persian Empire that lasted about 200 years was overrun by Alexander the Great. I believe it's about the first time I've mentioned Alexander, and come next month I'll be spending most of a whole class period talking about him. But Alexander the Great defeated the Persian Empire, and the Persians fell for a while, then they revived. But that's in the story for later chapters. But anyway, now, one thing though that must be mentioned, your book devotes a lot of time talking about this, is their religion. Persian religion. Now, most of the religions in the ancient world were not connected to morals. Judaism was an exception. And the other exception was the Persian religion. The Persians were monotheistic, similar to the Jews. Their chief god, I hope I'm pronouncing it right, Ahura Mazda, was their god. And his prophet was Zoroaster. Now, Zoroaster, the last time I researched him, I learned that at one time we believed that he lived around 600 BCE, about the time that the Jews were being carried captive. And some people believe that he was either highly influenced by the Israelis or that he influenced the Israelis. It's hard to, but then some further research indicates he might have lived about 1000 BCE, 400 years, and then there are some people who say that he might not even have existed. He might have been just an idea that the people had, but not a real person. Again, it's difficult to tell. All right, what did they believe? And here's where, again, it's going to sound a whole lot like Judeo-Christianity. They believed that there was not eternal, but that there was a long, long conflict between good and evil. and good and evil were nearly equal. But in the long run, eventually good would triumph over evil. But for each individual, it was up to us as individuals to choose whether it would be good or evil, and to make sure that we fought for the good. Persian boys were taught they were taught, of course, to fight, but they also were taught to speak the truth. Carry the lance and speak the truth. Again, connected with morality. There are a few Zoroastrians today. In fact, one of them made news. A few of them are still left in Iran, and they are persecuted by the Muslims, persecuted extensively, even as Christians and Jews are. But most of Zoroaster's followers today eventually made their way to India, and this is a problem that Zoroaster had. His followers could not keep out the Christians first, then they could not keep out the Muslims second. But some of his followers made their way to India, and they settled along the coast of western India, and they are a fairly wealthy group from what I understand today. Now, another quarrel I have with Zoroaster. Zoroaster believed that once you had set on a course for evil, you could never change and become good again. And I will say he may have been almost right. It's known that persons who fall into the trap of alcoholism have only a 1 in 20 chance of recovering. Persons who fall into the trap of substance abuse, any kind of drug, again, only have about a 1 in 20 chance of recovering. And when a judge sentences you, I sentence you to undergo rehab, the rehab will admit they have about 1 in 20 chance of getting you fixed up and straightened out. But I don't think Zoroaster, he may have almost got it right, but I do believe that a person can overcome a bad habit if they choose to hard enough, get help. Zoroaster believed you couldn't. The difference between me and him, I think you can. Some people do. All right. Now, before we leave, there are some things I want to say about the ancient world. First of all, in their day, they had nothing that we would call a constitution. In other words, like our country, now the Greeks were except the Greeks. Some of their city-states developed a constitution, and the politicians would swear to uphold the constitution. In our country, we wrote a document more than 200 years ago we call our constitution, and every president, every representative, every senator, every governor swears an oath to every judge, federal judge, swears an oath to uphold the Constitution. And it becomes our governing body, and it is what we supposedly live by. Instead of a constitution, it was a matter of a king would take over, and within 50 days he was expected to have set up his laws and he governed his realm by. And so much then depended on the charisma or the personality of one man. In olden times, if you liked the man, you followed him. If you didn't like him, you didn't follow him. Now, I want to say this. When I was in the Army, we were told, when you're saluting an officer, you're not saluting the man. You salute the office he holds. Whether he had, and you're saluting the bars or stars or the maple leaves on his collar. Any of you know anything about the Army, the officers either wear bars, stars, or maple leaves. So if you see a man with a gold maple leaf, a gold maple leaf, that's right. He has a rank of major. Some of you might know that. If you're an enlisted man, you're supposed to salute him. Again, what if the major is a louse and you know it? You salute him anyway. You follow him because of the rank he holds, the rank he's been given by the Army that you're part of. Not because you particularly like the man or even respect him. You respect the office. In the ancient world, it was for good food on the office, it's the man. If he has the capability to handle, to fill in the shoes of the office, you follow him. If he doesn't, you don't follow him. Again, so much depended on the leadership ability of a man, and a typical scenario is a really strong, charismatic leader would build up an empire. He died, turned the empire over to his son, and his son couldn't handle it, and whoosh, the empire got blown away. Another problem they had, oh yes, There was no democracy. Now, I say, as I said, problem. At the end of my last class, last spring, just before I gave the final exam, I told the class that I have all but lost faith in democracy. I'll repeat it here. What's wrong with democracy? Well, democracy does not work when the enemy is on the other side of the hill. Abraham Lincoln suspended our democracy during the 4 years he was in office, and so did Jefferson Davis, by the way. John Paul Jones, now quoted, he said, regards the principles for which we are fighting, we have none of those principles on board my ship. On board this ship, I'm in charge, and what I say goes, and if you don't like it, hooey on you. We don't have a democracy here. What's wrong with democracy? Well, in the ancient world, where you lived in this city-state, and you were born in a city-state, and in the city-state was a temple, you know, and a king, a palace for the king, a temple for the gods. But on this side was an enemy. Just over the horizon, you couldn't see him. On the other side over there was another enemy. And as sure as you showed the least sign of weakness, the enemy would come in and take over you. You either conquered him or he'd conquer you. Folks, there's no room for democracy under those conditions. Democracy works for a short time when you live in a place where the enemies are far away and can't easily get to you. Put the enemy at your doorstep. That's one of the problems of democracy. Another problem of democracy is that nobody knows who said this. We're trying to figure out. Democracy works until the ordinary person realizes he can dip his hand in the public pot. Pull out money from the public treasury. Some of you are looking at me like you've heard that quote. We don't know who said it, but it has been said repeatedly. They did not have democracy. And again, part of it was probably because they realized it didn't work. Now, the Greeks had democracy, and it failed. Then the Romans got a republican system, a form of democracy, and folk, it failed. Yes?
Did it last longer than ours? How long did
The Roman democracy can be said to have lasted about 200 years.
Okay, so that's...
Yeah, but then the Roman Empire lasted 1,000 years altogether, and then it was followed by the Byzantine Empire, lasted another 1,000 years.
Yeah.
But they so much, again, depended on the rule of one man. They didn't have what we would call democracy. Again, can't emphasize enough, the government was a matter of charisma. Whoever had the will, the means, the charisma, the ability to attract followers, he was the one who got the government. Coups were often the norm, and when a person died, he would try to turn the throne over to his son, but unless that son was capable of managing it, much too often. Now, of course, another problem they had was constant, well, okay, yeah, I'll close with this, I promise. In the battle between civilized and uncivilized, and this may surprise some of you, when you have a civilized city-state, a group of civilized, and around them is a bunch of barbaric, uncivilized people who usually wound up winning in the long run. The uncivilized in the long run. Now, with an exception, now when the Europeans came to the American Indians, they found the American Indians few in number, and the Europeans overwhelmed the American Indians more by numbers than by rifles, folks, because eventually the Indians got the rifles and the horses, learned how to use them. But the European women would have about 8 babies per woman, and the American Indian women wouldn't have more than 1 or 2 babies per woman. Pick the winner. Civilized people, though, tend to stop having numerous children, while uncivilized have children like crazy. Now, when I was sitting in a chair taking my master's degree, I had a committee of 3 persons, 2 men and 1 woman. The woman said a new barbaric theory about why the Roman Empire fell. The Roman Empire fell because their women stopped having children. I could have said, yes, it's a barbaric theory, all right, but it was the barbaric women who had all the babies. This is the truth. And guess what? Yeah, it took 400 years, but the barbaric women, with all their babies, that is, wound up overwhelming the Romans by sheer force of numbers. All right, I'll leave that. What's that?
Not like today, right?
Hey. Very much so, and hey, our barbaric enemies are going to whip us if we don't change our ways fast.